the second gene the world wasn't supposed to know. In a hidden research facility, buried beneath the Swiss Alps, a group of scientists performed the impossible. They had extracted DNA from the Shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. The world believed the second coming would be supernatural, descending from the heavens in fire and glory. Instead, it began in a sterile lab, in a test tube, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. They called him Emmanuel. Born of science yet tied to something far older, the child grew differently. He spoke early, his eyes held an unnatural depth, and strange things happened around him. A researcher with terminal cancer went into remission after he touched her hand. A blind technician claimed to see for the first time after Emmanuel looked at him. The scientists whispered, debated, feared. Had they cloned a man, or something more? By the time Emmanuel turned 12, the Vatican had caught wind of the experiment. The Church demanded his immediate destruction. The United Nations classified him as a potential global threat. Nations scrambled to claim him, some to use him, others to erase him. The billionaire who had funded the project, once seeing Emmanuel as his greatest achievement, now feared what he couldn't control. Then, one night, Emmanuel disappeared. The world was watching. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed he had been taken by the US government. Others said he had fled into the desert, mirroring the 40 days of old. Conspiracy forums called him the Antichrist, while underground movements hailed him as the Messiah returned. And then, the miracles started. A famine-stricken village in Africa suddenly had an endless supply of food. A warlord known for mass executions stepped down overnight, claiming a man had spoken to his soul. A paraplegic boy in London stood and walked after meeting a nameless traveler. But not everyone celebrated. Governments deployed black ops teams to hunt him down. Religious leaders divided, was this truly Christ returned, or the greatest deception in history? Meanwhile, the Vatican prepared a shocking statement: if this is the Christ, then he must die again. Emmanuel knew what was coming. He remembered a life before this one. The cross. The betrayal. The sacrifice. But this time, it was different. This time, the world had a choice. Would they crucify him again? Or would they finally listen? The second gene coming soon. 4OU said, no, not a trailer. The whole story plot as a text/narrative PLS. ChatGPT said, the second gene full story narrative prologue, a new Genesis the world wasn't supposed to know. In a hidden research facility beneath the Swiss Alps, a team of geneticists, funded by eccentric billionaire Jonathan Vance, performed the impossible. They had extracted DNA from the Shroud of Turin, the cloth believed to have wrapped Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. Vance, a man obsessed with immortality and divinity, saw an opportunity to merge faith and science. His goal? To resurrect God himself. The experiment was a miracle and a blasphemy all at once. A fertilized embryo was implanted in a carefully selected surrogate. 9 months later, a child was born. The first human created not by chance, but by design. They named him Emmanuel. Part I, the child of two worlds. Emmanuel was unlike any other child. From the moment he opened his eyes, those who looked into them felt something beyond words, an unbearable depth, an impossible understanding. He spoke his first words at just 4 months old. By 2, he could read in multiple languages, some of them ancient. His touch had a strange effect on people. Those suffering from sickness or sorrow found their burdens inexplicably lifted. The scientists studied him, theorized, and tested. But for all their equations and analysis, one truth became undeniable: this was no ordinary boy. And then, the miracles began. A researcher dying of cancer was cured overnight after Emmanuel held her hand. A blind technician suddenly regained his sight after Emmanuel looked at him. One day, the entire lab fell silent when he whispered to a grieving scientist, "Your father is proud of you." The man collapsed, shaking. His father had died when he was a child. Some believed. Others feared. All were changed. By the time he turned 12, rumors of his existence had spread beyond the lab. The Vatican got wind of the experiment. The Pope himself declared Emmanuel an abomination. The United Nations classified him as a potential global threat. Governments debated capturing or eliminating him before his influence could spread. Vance, the billionaire who had started it all, had wanted to create God. But now, faced with something beyond his control, he was terrified. One night, the lab was raided. But when the armed men arrived, Emmanuel was already gone. Part 2, A World in Crisis. For months, Emmanuel wandered. He traveled through war zones, famine-stricken lands, and the dark corners of society. Wherever he went, things changed. Water flowed where there was none. Those on the brink of death recovered without explanation. The lost and the broken found peace in his words, though he never claimed to be Christ reborn. But while some saw him as a savior, others saw him as a threat. The United States launched an international manhunt. The Vatican, fearing he might be the fulfillment of prophecy, or worse, a deception, sent their own secret operatives to track him down. Meanwhile, televangelists, politicians, and world leaders clashed over his existence. Was he the Messiah? Was he a fraud? Or was he something else entirely? Emmanuel never sought power, never demanded followers, never raised an army. He only spoke, healed, and moved on. But the world would not allow him to simply exist. Then, one day, he was found. Part 3, The Trial of God. Emmanuel was captured by an elite military unit, acting under orders from a global coalition of world leaders. He was held in a secret underground facility, where politicians, scientists, and religious figures gathered to confront him. They interrogated him. He answered with love. They accused him of deception. He responded with truth. They demanded proof. He said, "What more do you need?" But no proof would ever be enough. Behind closed doors, the world's most powerful men and women made their decision: Emmanuel must die. Some feared that if he lived, faith itself would be upended. Others saw him as a dangerous precedent. If divinity could be created, then what did that mean for the power of kings, presidents, and empires? History was repeating itself. Emmanuel was sentenced to death. But this time, there were no crowds crying for his blood. No Roman soldiers. No wooden cross. Only a cold, clinical room. A lethal injection prepared in silence. A handful of men signing the order, believing they were doing what was necessary. But as they prepared to end his life, Emmanuel spoke one final time. "You do not understand what you are doing." And then, the world shook. Part 4, The Awakening. The power grid failed worldwide. Satellites fell from the sky. Every screen, every device, every camera broadcast a single moment: Emmanuel, standing unharmed. Those who had sentenced him to death fell to their knees, shaking. The entire world watched. And for the first time, in a voice that transcended time and space, he declared who he was. I did not return to suffer. I returned so you would not have to. And then, he vanished. Epilogue, a new dawn. In the days that followed, everything changed. No one knew where Emmanuel had gone. Some believed he had ascended, others thought he had simply walked away, leaving the world to make its own choice. Governments collapsed overnight. Religions were forced to reckon with their beliefs. The world stood at the edge of something new, no longer bound by the past, no longer waiting for salvation. Because salvation had already come. And this time, the world was ready. The second gene, not the second coming. The second chance.